I learned my marriage was over on a random Tuesday morning, while tying my shoes and smiling at nothing. Weeks later, I would hand my wife a folder so heavy with truth that it made her knees buckle. And the strangest part is that she still called me old-fashioned, as if honesty were a personality flaw. I used to believe that if you treated a relationship like a partnership, it would behave like one. You show up, you listen, you don't play games. My wife and I had been together long enough that our routines felt permanent. Coffee at the same time, jokes we repeated, because they still worked quiet evenings that felt earned. So when that night happened, with our friends sitting around a table laughing and pretending to debate modern ideas, I thought nothing of it at first. One couple started talking about open relationships, saying freedom was the future and jealousy was outdated. Some people laughed, others rolled their eyes. I remember shaking my head and saying it sounded like chaos dressed up as philosophy. A few nodded in agreement. Then I noticed my wife leaning forward, smiling in a way I had not seen in a while. She wasn't joking, she was defending it, saying people evolve and labels limit growth. The table went quiet for a second, and I asked her calmly what she meant. She waved her hand and said it was just conversation, nothing more. The moment passed, but something stayed behind, like a smell you can't place. After that night, small things changed, not dramatically, but consistently. She started dressing differently to run simple errands. Her phone became a private object instead of a shared one, and she began going out more often, always with a reason that sounded reasonable enough to not argue with. A friend's store, a late meeting helping someone who needed advice. I asked questions, not accusations, and she answered smoothly, with a tone that suggested I was silly for even wondering. I trusted my instincts enough to stay alert, but respected myself too much to beg for reassurance. Instead, I watched and listened. I noticed patterns, times, days, excuses that repeated like a playlist. What surprised me most was not suspicion, but clarity. Once I stopped trying to convince myself everything was fine, the world became very organized. Receipts appeared where they should not have been. Locations did not match stories. I didn't confront her because I didn't need drama, I needed facts. So I documented quietly screenshots, timestamps, messages that were never meant for me, but found their way anyway. There was no rage, no shouting, just a steady feeling like finishing a puzzle you did not want to start. When I finally spoke to a lawyer, it felt less like betrayal and more like administration. He reviewed everything, nodded once, and said, "You are prepared." That word prepared felt better than any apology I would never get. I went home that day and watched my wife talk about her plans for the weekend. And I realized she truly believed I would never catch up. And that realization hurt less than I expected. It clarified everything. Because love does not require blindness, and respect does not survive secrecy. And that was the moment I decided I would end this with dignity, not noise. I didn't rush anything after that decision because patience became my quiet advantage. Every time she left the house with that casual confidence, I felt less anger and more curiosity. Not about who she was seeing, but about how long she thought the performance could last. She started using phrases like space and growth and modern thinking, words that sound impressive until you realize they are often used to avoid simple responsibility. She would come home energized some nights, overly cheerful, asking me about my day as if checking a box. Other nights, she was distant, claiming exhaustion from helping friends. I responded the same way every time, calm, polite, observant. Inside, I was cataloging details like a librarian of my own life. Times, locations, tone changes. It was strange how easy it became once emotions stepped aside. I slept well, ate well, even laughed more than before. Clarity does that to a person. One evening, she casually mentioned that one of the couples from that original dinner had invited her out for drinks to talk more about open-minded living. She said it with a smile that expected approval. I simply nodded and said I hoped she had fun. She paused for half a second, as if waiting for a reaction that never came. That pause told me more than any confession ever could. The evidence kept building without effort. Messages sent while she claimed to be asleep. Photos cropped poorly, locations tagged accidentally. The funny thing is, people think cheating is bold, but it is actually sloppy. It relies on the assumption that the other person is too afraid to look closely. I was not afraid, I was just finished guessing. At one point, she tried to test me directly, saying she felt I was becoming distant and not very progressive. She asked if I ever thought about redefining our relationship. I looked at her and said, "Redefining usually means someone already broke the definition." She laughed nervously and said I was dramatic. I smiled because dramatics require uncertainty, and I had none left. I didn't tell anyone what I knew. Not friends, not family. This was not about revenge or public judgment. This was about control over my own exit. I scheduled meetings, quietly organized finances, separated digital access. The lawyer helped me structure everything so cleanly that even I was impressed. It felt like preparing to move houses, except the house was a version of my life that no longer existed. The night before I planned to give her the papers, she came home unusually emotional, saying she felt disconnected and confused about who she was becoming. She said maybe society was changing faster than people could handle. I listened carefully, then said, "Sometimes people don't change. They just reveal themselves." She stared at me like I had spoken a language she almost understood. That night I slept peacefully, knowing the storm was scheduled, and I would be watching it from dry ground. Not because I was heartless, but because I respected myself enough to stop negotiating with someone who had already chosen. And in the morning, I placed the folder on the table, thick, calm, undeniable, and waited for the right moment to open the door to the truth. The moment arrived quietly, which felt appropriate because lies are loud, but truth does not need volume. She was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, talking about errands as if this were any other morning. I placed the folder between us without drama and asked her to take a look when she had a moment. She smiled distractedly, then opened it, and everything slowed down. I watched her eyes move across pages, screenshots, timelines, hotel receipts, messages printed in plain ink with dates that refused to argue back. At first she laughed lightly, saying this was some kind of misunderstanding. Then she stopped laughing, because misunderstandings do not come with patterns. She looked up at me, searching for emotion, anger, sadness, anything she could respond to. What she found instead was calm, that confused her more than rage ever could. She asked how long I had been spying on her, and I corrected her, saying, "Observing is not spying when you are paying attention to your own life." Then came the tears, sudden, dramatic, and almost rehearsed. She said she felt trapped, misunderstood, stifled by expectations. She said the world was changing, and I was refusing to evolve. That word again, modern, as if loyalty were a software update I had skipped. I listened without interrupting because I wanted her to hear herself. Eventually she said the part she thought would save her, that it did not mean anything, that it was just exploration, just experience. I told her calmly that meaning is not decided by intention, but by impact. I explained that I did not gather evidence to punish her, but to protect myself. The divorce papers were already filed. Everything was documented and fair. No theatrics, no surprises left. She stared at the pages again, as if they might rearrange themselves into forgiveness. She asked if there was any way to fix this, and I said honesty arrives too late when it shows up only after exposure. That was when she accused me of being cold, calculated, unromantic. I smiled slightly and said, "Love does not require chaos to feel alive." She stood up, pacing, saying people like me fear freedom and that I was not a modern person. I almost laughed because it was such a strange thing to say to someone who had just freed himself. What she did not understand was that I had already grieved the relationship weeks ago in silence. This conversation was not an ending, it was a formality. The real ending happened the night I realized trust cannot be negotiated once it is treated as optional. And as she cried and argued and tried to rewrite the story in real time, I felt something unexpected, not bitterness, but relief. Because when someone shows you who they are, and you believe them without trying to rescue the illusion, you gain something valuable, clarity without regret. I told her the arrangements were reasonable, and that I wished her well, genuinely. That confused her too. Kindness always does when it arrives without conditions. She gathered herself, eventually wiping her face, asking where she would go. I said that was no longer my responsibility, and that answer landed harder than anger ever could. As she left the room, I realized the suspense I had been living under was gone, replaced by something quieter and stronger. The certainty that whatever came next would be built on truth, not trend. After she left the house that day, the silence felt different, not empty, but accurate. I sat at the same kitchen table where the folder had changed everything and noticed how calm my breathing was. No shaking, no regret, just the steady rhythm of someone who had stopped lying to himself. People think the hardest part is confrontation, but for me, it had been the weeks of pretending nothing was wrong. She began messaging later that evening, long emotional texts swinging between apology and accusation. One moment she said she never meant to hurt me, the next. She said I was rigid and emotionally unavailable. I did not respond right away, not out of strategy, but because I had nothing left to explain. I eventually replied with one sentence saying, "I hope you find what you are looking for, just not at my expense." Friends started calling soon after because stories travel fast when someone needs validation. I didn't correct narratives or defend myself. I simply told the truth when asked, and stayed silent when not. Something interesting happened. People noticed the difference. Calm is persuasive when chaos is the alternative. A few mutual friends admitted they had felt something was off for a while. One even mentioned that open relationship conversation again, and how intense she had been about it. What amused me was how often the word modern kept coming up, as if commitment were outdated technology. I started to see it for what it was, not progress, but permission. Permission to avoid accountability while demanding understanding. Once I saw that clearly any lingering doubt dissolved, the legal process moved forward smoothly because preparation removes drama. Documents were signed, schedules arranged, assets divided without courtroom theatrics. She tried once more to suggest mediation framed as growth and maturity. I declined, politely saying boundaries are also a form of maturity. She didn't like that answer, but she accepted it because there was nothing left to negotiate. During that time, I focused on rebuilding routines, not to distract myself, but to reinforce stability. Morning walks, reading cooking meals that did not involve conversation. I rediscovered how much mental space opens up when you are not managing someone else's contradictions. Humor returned, first dry and quiet, then genuine. I laughed one morning, realizing I no longer checked my phone with dread. She eventually came by to collect the last of her things and tried to reminisce, standing in the doorway, saying we had good times. I agreed, because denying reality helps no one. I also said good times do not excuse bad choices. She nodded as if that were new information. Before leaving, she said she hoped I would become more open-minded someday. I wished her clarity because open-mindedness without honesty is just confusion with better branding. After she drove away, I didn't feel victorious in the cinematic sense, no dramatic music, no raised fists. What I felt was grounded. I had not won against her, I had chosen myself. And that realization marked the beginning of something far more important than revenge, a future built on alignment rather than compromise. Time has a way of revealing what noise tries to hide. Weeks passed, and life settled into a new rhythm that felt unfamiliar but honest. I stopped explaining my situation altogether because it no longer defined me. People filled in their own conclusions, and I let them. The truth did not need a spokesperson. What surprised me was how often I caught myself smiling for no reason. Not because I was happier in some dramatic sense, but because I was lighter. I no longer edited my thoughts or softened my instincts. I trusted myself again, and that trust changed everything. Even small decisions felt cleaner when they were not filtered through someone else's secrets. She reached out once more, saying she wanted closure, which I understood as control wrapped in reflection. We met briefly in a neutral place, and she spoke about lessons, growth, and how the experience had changed her. I listened politely, then said, "Closure is not a conversation. It is acceptance." She looked disappointed, as if hoping for a shared moral ending. But some stories end with separation, not reconciliation. She mentioned again that phrase about modern relationships, suggesting that society would eventually agree with her. I told her society does not live in my house, and it does not wake up next to me every morning. Values are not trends, they are choices. That seemed to land because she went quiet for a moment and nodded. After that meeting, I felt something close, fully. Not anger, not sadness, just completion. I stopped revisiting memories to analyze them. The past took its proper place as information, not identity. I focused forward, intentionally building a life that matched my standards without apology. I reconnected with old interests that had nothing to do with compromise. learning for the sake of curiosity, traveling alone, enjoying silence without labeling it loneliness. I realized that dignity is not loud, it is consistent. It shows up in how you exit situations that no longer respect you. People asked if I would ever trust again, and I answered honestly saying, trust was never the problem. Misplaced trust was, I trust myself now to walk away sooner, to listen when patterns speak, and to choose alignment over attachment. The irony was clear to me. In trying to be modern, she had underestimated something timeless, self-respect. And in losing her, I had gained something far more durable: clarity without bitterness, confidence without cruelty, and the quiet certainty that my future would not require explanations. Looking back, I realized the real suspense of the story was never about catching her or confronting her. It was about whether I would betray myself to keep the peace. That question followed me quietly for a while, even after everything was settled, because habits linger longer than people. There were moments when nostalgia tried to rewrite history, presenting edited highlights like a greatest hits album. I let those moments pass without arguing with them. I understood that memory without context is just temptation, so I stayed grounded in facts, not emotions. Facts had carried me this far, and they were not about to fail me now. I noticed how differently people treated me once they sensed I was no longer explaining myself. Conversations changed, tone, respect arrives naturally when you stop negotiating your worth. Even casual interactions felt sharper, as if the world responds differently when you do not apologize for clarity. One afternoon, I ran into one of the friends who had been part of that original dinner conversation. She awkwardly mentioned how intense the open relationship talk had been, and said she hoped there were no hard feelings. I smiled and said ideas are not dangerous when people are honest about their intentions. That ended the conversation cleanly. What mattered most was internal. I stopped replaying scenarios, wondering if I could have prevented anything. Prevention assumes responsibility for someone else's choices. I released that illusion fully, understanding that loyalty is not something you convince someone to value. They either do or they explain why they do not. I started setting quiet standards for my future. Not lists, not rules, just clarity, honesty before excitement, consistency before charm, accountability before philosophy. These were not reactions to pain, they were confirmations of who I had always been. There was peace in knowing I did not harden myself to survive. I stayed open without being naive, calm without being passive, and firm without being cruel. That balance felt like the real reward of the entire experience. Sometimes late at night I would think about how close I came to ignoring my instincts for the sake of comfort. And instead of fear, I felt gratitude, because listening to yourself once can change the entire direction of your life. I understood then that modern or old-fashioned were meaningless labels. Integrity does not age, and neither does self-respect. Trends come and go, but character stays, and I had finally aligned my life with mine. The story did not end with a dramatic moment, because real conclusions rarely announce themselves. It ended gradually in ordinary days that felt solid and honest. Mornings where I woke up without rehearsing conversations in my head, and evenings where silence felt like a companion instead of a threat. I noticed how my decisions became simpler, not easier, but cleaner. When something felt off, I addressed it. When something felt right, I allowed it. There was no longer a need to intellectualize behavior or translate disrespect into philosophy. Clarity removed the need for interpretation. Months later, I heard through mutual connections that she was still explaining her choices, still framing everything as evolution and misunderstood freedom. I felt no satisfaction in that information, only distance. Because when you stop needing someone to understand you, they lose their influence entirely. I never regretted how I handled things. Not because it was painless, but because it was aligned. I did not yell, I did not beg, I did not compete with anyone for my own place in my marriage. I chose evidence over emotion, preparation over panic, and dignity over drama. That choice shaped everything that followed. What stayed with me most was the lesson that love is not proven by tolerance of betrayal, but by respect for boundaries. I did not lose a wife, I released a version of life that required me to shrink to maintain it. And in doing so, I expanded into something steadier and more self-aware. If there is a moral here, it is simple and quietly powerful. Pay attention early trust patterns over promises, and never confuse modern language with mature behavior. Growth that requires secrecy is not growth at all. I moved forward without bitterness, without urgency, and without fear. Not because I was unaffected, but because I was resolved. The future no longer needed suspense to be interesting. It only needed honesty, and that was something I could finally guarantee.